I was just thinking when I came in there how wonderful the flowers smell. I've never smelt the chamber quite like this. It's usually blood and guts and thunder. So I hope you're all going to behave yourself today. I'm Trish Marwick, I'm the presiding officer, and I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing the event this afternoon, which will try to decide which historical figures should be included in the Great Tapestry of Scotland, Parliament of the Ancestors Parliament. Joining me in what promises to be a fascinating discussion are Alexander McCall-Smith, Sandy is a Rhodesian-born Scottish writer and Emeritus Professor of Medical Law at the University of Edinburgh. He is internationally renowned as a writer of fiction. He is most widely known as the creator of the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series. Historian and author Alistair Moffat. Alistair is the director of the Lennox Love and Borders Book Festivals. His recent books include Tyneside and the Reivers, which for many weeks were on the Scottish bestsellers list, both of which have been made into television series. Our next special guest is Professor Tom Devine. Tom is a senior research professor in history at Edinburgh University. He is the author and editor of some 30 books and numerous articles, and we are absolutely delighted to have him with us today. The final panellist is the Herald's literary editor, Rosemary Goring. Rosemary has written many reference books, among them the Loose Dictionaries of Writers and Literary Characters. She was literary editor of Scotland Sunday for several years before moving to the Herald. Her latest book is Scotland, the Autobiography, and it is a fantastic book, and I recommend you buy it and read it. The essential question for our debate today is, who has shaped Scotland? What we'd like to do is invite Alexander Sandy McCall-Smith to set the scene and to provide us with a background on the Great Tapestry of Scotland. Sandy.
Thank you very much, Tricia. I'm going to be very brief, Tricia, because we've got a lot of names to think about and a very interesting discussion ahead of us. I thought I'd just say something very quickly about the background to this project. And it really all flows from an earlier tapestry, which many people, I think, will have seen, the Preston Pans tapestry, which tells the story of Bonnie Prince Charlie's escapades, or some of them. It ends on a positive note, and of course the story didn't end up quite that positively for him later on. I went to a display of this in the Dovecot studios in Edinburgh, very distinguished tapestry studios, you know, and there was this marvellous tapestry which had been designed by a very great community artist, Andrew Crummey. And we walked around this room looking at this very impressive tapestry, very long tapestry. And as I did so, not only was I tremendously impressed by what we saw there, but I looked at the faces of people who were looking at it. It's always very interesting when you go into a gallery, for example, not necessarily to look at the paintings, but to look at the effect that the paintings are having on people. And I saw the delight on the faces of people looking at this tapestry. And so I approached Andrew initially, and asked him whether he'd be prepared to take on a tapestry telling the whole story of Scotland from the beginning, not to the end, but until 1999. And he said yes. And so I phoned up Alistair Moffat, who, as you know, is a very well-respected historical writer, writes in all sorts of areas of Scottish life, and asked Alistair whether he was prepared to come on board and really effectively decide what would be in this, well, put up issues for discussion as to inclusion on this tapestry. And we appointed several other trustees, and that's it. And the whole thing now goes ahead, and throughout Scotland now, people are stitching this tapestry. The panels have gone out, and I know that a number of stitchers working on it are with us today. It's a marvellous thing. Most of them are women. There are some men stitchers, but most of them are women throughout Scotland working in small groups. So this is a very great a community arts project. It's a massive community arts project involving some 500-600 people, creating what we hope will be a wonderful record of Scottish history to be appreciated by people, we hope, for centuries to come. We as the trustees will give it to the nation. This is a gift to Scotland. We'll have to find a suitable place for it to be displayed, because I think it could be a great tourist attraction, and I must say I'm immensely excited by it. And it contains the vision of those who've been involved in choosing the subjects, principally Alistair Moffat, but also Andrew Crummy, and of course the head Stitchley, Dolly Wilkie. And these, it's going to be an object of very, very great beauty that I think is going to bring so much pleasure to people. So that's the background to it, and we're going to finish it next year, by hook or by crook.
Or by needle.
By needle.
I came into the story when Sandy and Alistair and Andrew came to see me, and I must confess I was completely blown away by the sheer vision of what they were attempting to do, and I actually felt really quite emotional about it, and I think, you know, that is shared by a number of people, because this is going to be the most amazing object. It's going to be a thing of great beauty, and what I thought I would do is just give you some of the most astonishing statistics linked to the tapestry. 50,000 sewing hours, equivalent to sewing 24 hours a day for 6 years. 49,000 metres of yarn, enough to lay up and down Ben Nevis 37 times. It's going to cover 12,012 years of Scottish history. There are already over 300 stitchers. There's going to be over 160 panels, and it's going to be one beautiful tapestry which is going to chronicle the history of Scotland from the earliest days till 1999. And I'm excited about that. So, we could maybe turn to Alistair now. Alistair, maybe you could run us through, for us, the usual suspects from Scottish history and who you think, without question, should appear in the Parliament of the Ancestors.
Thank you very much, Tricia. I think the first thing to say is that this project is incredibly historically accurate in one regard at least, and that is it will be a history of Scotland, pictures of lots of Scottish men made by women. So that will be correct. When I was driving up from the Borders this morning, looking at the landscape, at what my mother would have called well-washed, I thought about the land as an element in this tapestry, and it's a huge element. Andrew and I have thought about this and worked on it a great deal. We were inspired enormously by the great Gaelic poem and song, An Áireachd Ard, the surge of the sea. And it begins with the sea, but throughout it we think, and I have thought a great deal about the land and the people who made the land. It's not just a geological accident. The way that Scotland looks is because of many, many, many thousands of people. And we've memorialized these people throughout the whole thing. And also, we've been very conscious, particularly in the last 300 years, of the people who made the cities, who made Industrial Revolution Scotland, the men who laid out the roads and built the tenements and so on. So there are lots and lots of nameless people in this tapestry, as well as famous names, and I want people to be clear about that. We've not missed out. I hope we haven't missed out ordinary people. We've got Tom Devine here and Rosemary Goring, and between us, the three of us are going, as Tricia said, to basically posit what we think are unarguable names for the Parliament of the Ancestors, the last panel, and we're going to do it in turn. I'm going to take the earlier period. I'm going to talk about deed folk. Tom is going to talk about semi-deed folk, but a bit later. And Rosemary is going to talk about the very much alive. And I thought what we would do, if you agree, is basically go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And I think in terms of the participation of the audience, if you think we are absolutely crazy in any of these selections, please jump in, but you'll need to make an argument, because a rammy is what we hope to have, at least in part today. So I'll start off with these allegedly unarguable names. And the first named Scotsman in Tacitus's Agricola was Calgacus, the swordsman, who led the Pictish confederacy at Mons Gropius. Okay, he was a loser, but he was the first named Scot, and I think we should have Calgacus. Tom?
Okay, well, I'm going much further on, and maybe I should say is we're actually only allowed a couple of lines about each of these individuals. So this is quite difficult for me, because I'll have to control myself. Anyway, I'm moving right into the 18th century with the great star of the Scottish Enlightenment, possibly regarded, certainly in his time, as the world's greatest philosopher, and, if you like, the intellectual foundation of that great development in the history of this nation, and that's David Hume.
Thank you.
I would like to posit, firstly, Ali Bain, fantastic fiddler, you know, a man without whom Scotland today would not feel like the Scotland it is.
Next, I've got St Andrew. Okay, only bits of him came to Scotland, but he is our national saint, and he created our great pilgrim city.
Okay, I'm still in the same period of the late 18th century, and this time going back to Alistair's motif about the earth, and earth sciences and geological inquiry was as much a part of the Enlightenment period as philosophical analysis, and the great figure of that time is James Hutton.
You can see when I was doing my list, I was thinking in terms of music, you know, sort of politics, whatever, so there'll be little thematic clusters. So next in my music list is Evelyn Glennie, fantastic percussionist and musician who, you know, again, has to absolutely to be up there, inarguable.
There are historians who think this man didn't exist, but I certainly did, and this is Ninian, the first great saint, earlier than Columba, the apostle of the southern Picts, as Bede called him, and the man who created another great pilgrim site at Whithorn. So I'm going for Ninian.
Robert Burdens obviously has got to be on this list, well known as the national bard of Scotia. But I think also very important with I think one of the next names I'm going to talk about, somebody who in a sense defined, not simply for the Scot at home, but for the great Scottish diaspora of what a Scot was. And that's almost as important as the sheer lyricism of his songs and poetry.
You're talking about defining. I would say that Annie Lennox is a singer who in a way has defined this kind of political sense of the arts movement in the last 20, 30 years. So not just a musician, but also a politically active philanthropist.
What a list, eh? Columba. That's it. Tom?
Columba actually is associated with the place where we have our small estate on the Isle of Mull, Iona. Yeah, did you know that? No, okay. The second person in the list, in a sense, a literateur again like Burns, who has defined the nation not only for ourselves but for others, and possibly given Scotland its brand, and that's Sir Walter Scott in the 1820s, the world's not only first major historical novelist, but the first best-selling novelist, not simply in Europe, but also in the Americas.
If you can just say Columba, I can just say Lulu.
Agreed. Cuthbert. Durham Cathedral was built on Cuthbert's bones, but it's almost certain he originated near Melrose in the Scottish borders. He's the first great British saint, you could argue, in terms of the whole of Britain, and I would absolutely go for Cuthbert.
Okay, and one of the things that's coming through, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is the sheer range of these talents. And the next one is architecture. One of the foremost architects, not simply in Scotland, but in Europe in the 18th century, who fashioned some of the buildings that we now take to be typically Scottish, part of that great building tradition, and that's Robert Adam of the famous Adam family.
James Macmillan, a composer who needs no introduction whatsoever, one of our leading lights in classical composition, has to be there.
We've got a kind of theme music going, which is great. And
syncopation.
Syncopation. Constantine II climbed the Hill of Faith at Scone with Bishop Kelloch and was really, in my view, the first. It was the time. His reign was the time when Scotland became known as Ullapa, when the idea, I think, of Scotland really was born during Constantine's reign.
The forgotten man of Scottish science and intellectual life, James Clerk Maxwell. He was refused tenure at a university I used to teach in a few years ago, the University of Aberdeen, This is in conflict with what Einstein said about him. Without Clerk Maxwell, there would have been no theory of relativity. Aberdeen got it wrong.
That was a first. Possibly controversial, but Professor Peter Higgs, who's been part of the Boson-Higgs phenomenon, I don't think he's technically a Scot, but he's a Scot by formation, I would argue. So I think he has to be there.
Certainly he's at the University of Edinburgh. He must be a Scot.
Is he wholly Scottish?
I don't know, but he's been in here long enough, he's bound to be Scottish.
Exactly.
He is
Exactly. We can claim him.
The presiding officer has just baptised him. He is now.
Absolutely,
That's
absolutely.
good enough for us, I think.
He is one of us.
Great. King Macbeth. We just call him Macbeth, but he was King of Scotland and King of Moray. And if Macbeth's line had succeeded, it shows us that Scotland was not inevitable.
Whatever one's ecclesiastical or religious sympathies, it has to be admitted that the Kirk, the Church of Scotland, and Presbyterian religion in this country was one of the great formations of the nation. And in the 19th century, the best-known cleric, the superstar, if you like, of the Church, who led the Great Disruption of 1843, was Thomas Chalmers.
Nicely juxtapositioned, I think, is the creator, or one of the creators of Dolly the sheep. So a sort of god in some ways. He and his team, Dr. Ian Wilmot at the Roslin Institute, who took science an amazing leap forward, in terms of world science.
Malcolm Canmore, the Malcolm dynasty, perhaps one of the most successful Gallic kings of Scotland, and somebody who I think began to really assert the sense of Scotland again as a nation, like Constantine.
Queen Victoria, the first monarch to truly fall in love with this country, the creator of what we now call Balmoralism, the one who gave the kind of royal signature of approval to Scotland, and also helped to meld the Union in the 19th century.
Professor John Mallard, often overlooked, I think, but the man who invented MRI brain scanning, which has changed people's lives, not just here, but everywhere.
I'm getting really puffed up, Rosemary. It's great. It's wonderful. Queen Margaret, Canmore's queen, she brought a different kind of Christianity to Scotland, and again created a pilgrim focus at Dunfermline.
Again, the sheer energy of the Church of Scotland and of the other religions in Scotland in the 19th century meant that they had an impact worldwide. And I'm glad to see on this list not the predictable David Livingstone, but the less predictable Mary Slessor, the Dundonian mill girl who became known as the Great Mother of the Calabar because of her heroic work in that part of the world.
Sir Alex Ferguson, manager of United, Man United.
That's another Columba. David I, again, son of Canmore, but actually a king reared in an English Anglo-Norman milieu, who brought the great monasteries to Scotland, the border abbeys particularly.
Alexander Graham Bell, the telephone.
Now I'm on sport, I find it very difficult to narrow this one down. So I think Dennis Law, however, Scotland player, Man U player, he has to be there, surely.
Somerled, Lord of the Isles, Somerled the Viking. Again, a reminder that Scotland was not inevitable.
Some controversy over the role of John Logie Baird in terms of television development, but he was the first, in terms of his pioneering role, to transmit pictures over distance.
Sir Chris Hoy, Olympian extraordinaire.
William Wallace, guardian of the realm of Scotland while Scotland was kingless, and the beginnings of the sense of the community of the realm, the beginnings of a different way of looking at the polity in Scotland.
Robert Louis Stevenson, master storyteller, and by universal consent a few years ago, the author of Scotland's single most popular novel. Guess what it was?
Go on, then.
I've forgotten. No, it was Kidnapped.
Hamish McInnes, legendary mountaineer who not only climbed all the mountains but wrote about it and therefore brought them to everybody internationally.
Having started with a loser in the shape of Calgacus, I think we should have a winner in the shape of Robert the Bruce.
And a big winner he was indeed. The successor, if you like, to the Adam family in the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of Scottish architectural contribution and other forms of interior decoration, Charles Rennie Mackintosh.
Stephen Hendry, bringing snooker to the forefront, a sport that's often looked down on or sort of ignored, as it were. So I'd like him there.
John Barber, the first really memorable Scottish poet, I think.
The man from Darvel, Nobel laureate Sir Alexander Fleming, whose work has resulted in the saving of literally millions of lives since the introduction of his new drug. What would that be? I've forgotten that as well.
Richard Holloway, one of the great thinkers of our time, he dares to think beyond the conventional and has actually shaken up Scotland's theological thinking. Also, he'd look great in a tapestry. You'd always know who he was.
The stitcher's joy. We've also had our nation shaped by people who've made terrible decisions as well as good ones, and surely one of the architects of one of the more terrible decisions that we've ever made as a nation was James IV before Flodden.
Okay, not the inventor of penicillin this time, but Keir Hardie, who played a powerful role in the formation of the first great working class party in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party. And not known then as New Labour.
Sean Connery, the actor who needs absolutely no introduction anywhere.
Andrew Miller, who was vital in the building of the first printing press in Scotland.
Elsie Ingalls, heroic nurse and pioneer of medical treatment during the horrific times of the Great War.
John Belaney, as they call him in his native Port Seaton, who is just one of the most fabulous, interesting artists of our time.
John Knox, I think his principal achievement was as one of the makers of what they called at the time the Godly Commonwealth and its insistence, for purely religious reasons, on mass literacy. Surely one of our great legacies.
Will you stop your tickling joke? Harry Lauder, the man who, well, some think was the guiltiest Scotsman who ever lived because of the sham Scotia that he projected, but one of the few performers who could fill Carnegie Hall in the States time after time during his visits. A colossally important figure in selling that kind of particular Highlandist image of Scotia.
Alison Watt, an artist who is amazingly original, can do things with white paint that, nobody could do even at B&Q. She has to be there.
Mary Queen of Scots.
Let's pass on.
Okay.
J.M. Barrie, just one word for him, but he was bigger and deeper than this, from Kirriemuir, Peter Pan.
T.C. Smout, historiographer royal and the historian, par excellence, possibly with an exception, but I can't think of who that would be.
Well, he's losing his memory anyway.
You're fine.
James VI and first king of Great Britain.
Louis Grassic Gibbon, extraordinary novelist from the northeast of Scotland, charting the death of the old rural society in that period, round about the time of the Great War.
James Kelman, internationally accepted as one of the best, finest writers in the world, if not just in Scotland.
Another loser, Charles I.
He got his head chopped off.
That's him.
Eric Liddell, now world famous to many audiences because of Chariots of Fire, a graduate of Scotland's greatest university, missionary, man of high principle, somebody who should become, if you like, almost an image for all Scots in terms of aspiration and striving to be a good person.
Liz Lochhead, Scotland's national poet, and a kind of forerunner of the efflorescence of Scottish writing among women in the last 20, 30 years. She's been a real torch carrier for literature.
General David Leslie, great soldier, devout man, and I just liked him.
Okay. A truculent and recalcitrant figure in literary terms, but obviously by any standard an international star, and who took Scottish literature on quite decisively in the period from the 1920s until his death, Hugh MacDiarmid, otherwise known as C.M. Grieve.
Far from truculent, more of a chuckler, Alistair Gray, Glasgow and Scotland's own Renaissance man, artist and writer, and unbelievably characterful individual. I just like him, as you say.
Yeah. William Patterson, founder of the Bank of England.
You're all doomed. Lord Reith, extraordinary founder and fashioner of the BBC, and whose shadow still haunts the minds of Directors General of that organisation to this very day.
J.K. Rowling.
We've had no objections so far. Have you noticed that?
Do they know they can object?
Yeah, oh, yeah, I did say that.
Absolutely, really?
We said it quite quietly.
Okay.
They'll get their chance to object and to propose in a second or two.
James Small. How many people have heard of James Small? Oh, 2, 3, 4. Wonderful. Berwickshire blacksmith who invented the swing plough, which is made entirely cast in iron at the Carron Iron Works, and the swing plough changed the world because it made the kind of agriculture that we now recognise possible. A really great man.
Norman McCaig, part of a generation, a great generation, if you like, the forerunner of the current literary generation of Scotland, poet par excellence, and most of it done while smoking cigarettes.
Winnie Ewing, who sort of led the charge for the SNP as an MP when she took her seat at Westminster. Her shoes were pinching her, but the rest of her life was extremely open and flourishing, and it was a great day for the SNP.
I remember asking Norman McCaig how long it took him to write a poem. 2 fags. I'll jump in a bit to Tom's list and nominate Muriel Spark for her Spark.
And also Muriel Spark because she's Alan Taylor's favourite author. And Alan Taylor has got a relationship to the lady on my left. Jock Stein, par excellence, especially since he comes from Burnbank in Lanarkshire, or came from it. They're probably, apart from Ferguson, Scotland's greatest ever football manager. Margot
MacDonald, who again has just been a fantastic character and a real champion of Scottish politics, both with the SNP and now as an independent. We have to have her.
And our final proposal, I don't know how many that is, we've got, but the final one, of course, has to be Ur Wully. So that's it. That's
Can
it.
I have one more?
No.
One more? Excuse me, just one more living person. It's a nice one to follow on from Ur Wully. This is I was given 25, so I'm going to use them. Andrew Neil, journalist extraordinaire. A scary man, but a brilliant man as well.
Oh, can I raise an objection to that?
No.
If I'd known that was it.
Okay, before I turn to the audience, I think it's only fair that I get a wee pitch too. About 2 years ago, the Scottish Parliament decided that we would name our committee rooms after famous Scots, but there were some caveats. One was it was no living person. Secondly, we all of us, the 4 members, cross-party on the corporate body, had to agree to all of them. So that took out contentious political figures. So the names that we came up with, and some of them are replicated here, were James Clerk Maxwell, Alexander Fleming, Robert Burns, David Livingstone, and interestingly, one that wasn't mentioned by any of the panel, which I found a surprise and omission, and that's Adam Smith. And the final one was my particular push to be named, and that was Mary Somerville, who is unknown by so many people. She was born in Burnt Island. She was completely self-taught. It was a time when women did not go to university. She was a marvellous mathematician, physician, physicist. She wrote many books, The Mechanics of the Heavens. She wrote the textbooks for Oxford and Cambridge, the places where she herself was not allowed to go. But she actually wrote for them. She was the first person to sign the document for women's suffrage that was presented to the House of Commons. And she was one of the most famous people in the land. It was she for whom the word scientist was coined, because up till that point we talked about men of science. We didn't have people like Mary Somerville. So she's my pitch for all of this, Mary Somerville and Adam Smith. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Tell me, firstly, what do you think generally of the names that you've heard so far? Is there any that you would strike out? And thirdly, have you got one for yourself? Now, I see hands going up all over the place. I'm going to keep you very short. You heard how very quickly our panellists proposed their names. Can I ask you to be just as brief? The gentleman just in front of me. The microphone will find you.
Thank you. Can I ask a question before I give you some names? Did we include Andrew Carnegie or did we not in the list we've had?
No. He wasn't included in the list.
Can I suggest him? Then I would like to suggest some names from science and technology. I feel John Napier, who invented the logarithms, 1614, deserves consideration. I'd like to suggest some question marks about James Paraffin Young, the chemist who pioneered coal distillation and therefore formed the shale oil industry in West Lothian. I'd like to add in the list Robert Watson Watt, who invented radar, World War II. I realised as I was sitting here, we probably shouldn't forget the person who designed the Forth Road Bridge. The surname was Arrell, but I'm afraid the Christian name escapes me. William Arrell, thank you very much. And from today, I would like to suggest two names. One definitely is the person who built a company from scratch in Scotland with 400 employees, which is still trading, which is Wolfson Microelectronics, and that is Professor David Milne. And another name for consideration was...
You're using them all up. We need to let other people...
No, I'm just having a quick go with my brief. And the last name that I'd like to suggest was there's a very significant company in Edinburgh. It used to be called Ferranti, which is worldwide renowned in airborne radar. And when Ferranti went bust, it was taken over by GC Marconi. It's now an Italian company. And the person that really built that company is a person called John Ralston. And the surname is spelled Roulston.
Okay, many thanks. Right up at the very, very back, the back row, yeah. Your microphone is there. No, your microphone.
I come from the Scottish Poetry Library and I could suggest 25 poets to knock a lot of those snooker players off the list. But I think that the two that I would really want to propose most forcefully are Sorley MacLean, surely the greatest Gaelic poet and one of the greatest Scottish authors of the century, and the man who wrote the most inspiring public poem that I've read in the last 50 years for the opening of this very Parliament, and that's Edwin Morgan.
Okay. Gentlemen, middle to the side, there should be a light, come on, just wait for a light. Right.
One to take off the list. If Andrew Neil is on that, I shall come along with a pair of scissors and cut him out. I didn't like the way that Alistair...
We also have a list of villains, by the way. Maybe you should be first on it.
I didn't like the way that Alistair denigrated all the Stuarts. James IV, for instance, was actually a great king and a Renaissance king. But my two suggestions, please. The great general, the Marquis of Montrose, not only a great Jacobite hero, fantastic general, but a poet who composed the poem, "He either fears his fate too much, or his deserts are small, who puts it not unto the touch to win or lose it all," which was recited by Montgomery on the beaches of Normandy to the troops. And finally, a living person, not mentioned by Rosemary, Ian Hamilton Finlay, probably one of the most influential artists of our time.
Okay. The second from the back. Yeah, you.
We've just
Billy, have you
hello,
just
Billy
wait for
Kay.
to come in?
Yep. We've just come from another session on Don Roberto, Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham, who, along with Keir Hardie, founded the Labour Party and then got better sense and founded the Scottish National Party in 1928. I would think he would be a definite for it. I think the problem with some of the modern names Rosemary, is that a number of people would want to cut it apart once it was stitched together. I think you should go for people who actually want to be there, so that people like Lulu, anti-Scottish Parliament, people like Billy Connolly, the Little Pretendy Parliament, people who don't want to promote the Scottishness of Scotland, I would think you would have doubts about some of their inclusion. Therefore, perhaps you'd be better sticking with historic figures where there's no controversy, because a lot of people would object hugely to a number of people on the list.
You see, that's what we've tried to avoid in the corporate body. They try and, you know, because living people are so contentious. Rosemary.
Well, I once edited a book called the Scottish National, it wasn't this National Dictionary of Biography, it was the Scottish Biographical Dictionary, and boy did the living people cause a lot of trouble. I had a particularly bad incident when the Daily Record came to interview me in the offices at Chambers where I worked, and he you know, this was a book that was including all the ancient names that we've just heard, and plus one or two of the top figures, as I thought, and the contributors thought of this day. And he said to me earnestly, but you don't have Dougie Donnelly. And I said, who? So that was the headline, who is Dougie Donnelly? So you're always going to upset people who you have and haven't. And it's also safe, if you just go for the dead, you know that you don't create controversy in the same way. But we're not being safe today.
No, we're not being safe. I mean, this is about discussion, and if this doesn't end in a rammy, I'll be most disappointed. Gentleman in the middle at the back. I was going to say with the blue checket shirt, but there's actually two gentlemen with checket shirts on. Okay.
Firstly, from the world of sport, I think Bill Shankly has to go in. If Ferguson and Steen are there, great Scotsman in terms of sport. And I think if we're going to have a army, if Montrose goes in, so does Archibald Campbell, Marquis of Argyll. Leader of the Covenanter movement, and we shouldn't forget, ladies and gentlemen, it was during that period that the Scottish Parliament was at its most powerful, and it had its first elected president in 1640, so Argyll should go in.
Right, okay. If you just wait and your microphones will come on. No, when I call you, your microphones will come on, and if you don't get too close to it, they're really quite sensitive. The other gentleman in the blue check shirt up the back. Just leave your microphone, it'll come on for you. That's it.
I would remove Andrew Neil, who I regard as an anti-Scot rather than a Scotsman. He almost destroyed one of our best papers, and replace him with William McIlvenney. Okay. I can't understand.
Right. The lady in the front, and fetching black and white.
I'd definitely get rid of Lulu, I mean, I suppose it's meant to be a musical contribution. Why not the Proclaimers or even Paolo Nutini? I'm a proud Leither. And just throw in a few names like Eduardo Paolozzi, even from Elgin originally in Murray. I would like Jessie Kesson, who I think is totally underrated as when it comes to writing.
Gentleman right in the front.
Just very briefly, James Paraffin Young was mentioned, and we should bear in mind he literally shaped Scotland. Think of all those bings in West Lothian.
Gentleman right in the front on this side.
You really can't leave out David Livingstone. He discovered most of the Black Continent, if you like, the Dark Continent as they call it, and also the source of the Nile. So you can't leave him out. Who was it invented the slinger sewing machines and brought so much employment to Clydeside?
You're going to tell us, aren't you?
Eh?
Are you going to tell us?
Absolutely not, I'm asking.
Pass.
It'll be Slinger, whoever he is.
Ifield, O-grade sewing and needlework. I can't work sewing machines.
The Singer sewing machine was an American company.
Was it?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Or at least in its origin.
Lady...
One of the first manifestations of inward investment, of which we've had quite a lot.
Okay. Lady second row in the middle here, with her hand up. Try and speak and see if the mic gets you. Can we get the mic on somewhere?
It does.
That's it.
I was concerned not to hear any mention of the name Stevenson, because the Stevenson family and their construction of lighthouses are really significant in Scotland's contribution to international shipping, apart from anything else.
That seems to have gone down rather well. Lady right at the back. Yeah, she's got her hand up. Yep, on you go.
David Sterling for the SAS.
The gentleman in the same row at the edge. Yep.
3 suggestions. I represent an organisation of disabled people, and I didn't hear many disabled Scots in there. So Blind Harry, the great biographer of Wallace, who went on, to be the second most popular author after the Bible for 300 years after he wrote the Wallace, and then inspired Burns to write Scots We Hae, etc. A great literary figure. Scotland's Homer, not as great a poet, but certainly one that laid down a history. A couple of people you might not be as familiar with. Barry Moore, Big Mary of the Songs for the Gaeltag, who wrote Farewell to the Place about Skye and inspired the Scottish Land League in the Battle of the Braes and afterwards. To have the first MPs elected out with the 2 main parties until then, the Tories and the Liberals, and the Land League won 6 seats, standing against both. And finally, Mrs. Barber of Mrs. Barber's Army, who led the Glasgow women in a rent strike during the First World War that established the first Fair Rent Act, which changed dramatically the lives of millions of working people.
Well, they're now coming thick and fast. Gentleman front. Yep.
A number of people have already made the point about the contentiousness of including living people in this list. And I think the problem with living people is that there simply hasn't been enough time to allow a proper evaluation of their historical contribution. And even among historical figures, it's not clear in a lot of cases whether enough time, that there has been enough time to evaluate their historical significance. And listening to a lot of the historical figures that have been proposed so far, most of the people, even the people I agree with, do not strike me as truly unarguable. That's the only point I want to make. I don't want to propose any figures myself.
That's okay. I mean, it's, as long as we can argue about these things, it's great. It wouldn't be the Scottish Parliament if we didn't argue. Rosemary, did you want to say something there?
I'm a journalist, and constantly we sort of table thump and say this is inarguable, but it's really just whistling in the dark, because everything's up for arguing. And I think, every single name I've proposed, really, you could spend an hour rightly picking apart. And I think not so much with the ones that you two have done. I think you've had the really easy job here, actually, if I may say so. But then
I agree.
I think they've got to come clean as well. I mean, for example, I was handed this list an hour ago, so it's not any imprimatur of mine. If I had been asked personally to come up with this list, I think some of the names have already been proposed are very interesting. I was particularly interested in the rent strike intervention, because one of the things I've always thought about this kind of exercise, apart from anything else, professional historians get quite snooty about it, the individual in history. We tend now to study, quote, forces, unquote. But one of the if you like, heroic elements, particularly in 20th century city Scotland and late 19th century urban Scotland, who have been completely underrated because they kept families together, often in terrible circumstances, and that's the mammies of Scotland. The mothers of the working classes, often having to live with alcoholic husbands, irregular employment, and overcrowding, which was in Scotland especially so horrendous compared to other countries. One of the problems we've got is we've been asked to talk about individuals, but there are classes of people who are important as well.
Well, I think one of the things that I'd like to come back to,
yeah,
on
please
that.
Do. I know what you're going to say here, and I think it's important that you
yeah, I mean, when I talked about this at the beginning, I was saying that we did indeed deal with that throughout the tapestry. And there were many individuals who would, as you said, the mammies of Scotland, who could not be named, as individuals. And I agree that, to an extent, thinking about the gentleman in the front row said, we could be here till Tuesday.
Yeah.
You know, if we did exhaustively argue, we've got to make a decision, gang. And I think that can be very mind-clearing in some ways, very mind-clearing. And I have to say, I think the interventions from the audience have been terrific.
Lady in the middle to the left-hand side of me. Yeah.
Thank you. Coming back to the debate, which is very interesting, about living or non-living people, I'm totally with Rosemary. I think including living people such as Sir Chris Hoy, we don't need to evaluate him anymore. He has proved his worth with the number of Olympic medals that he has received, the inspiration that he has brought to hundreds and hundreds of potential cyclists throughout Scotland and throughout the UK. And it's an area of sport that's really gripped the nation and could go a long, long way and produce many future Olympians. I'm not so sure about Lulu, but I definitely think there's an argument, a good argument for our living legends to inspire the future.
Gentleman to my left. Yeah, you. Just wait on the light coming.
Just Richard, shout. Thank you. I have been struck by the BBC coverage lately about the number of medals, etc. I think Chris Hoy was such a marvellous ambassador with his modesty that was what I liked to represent Scotland. And I used to do football broadcasts in Glasgow as a young student to be neutral. And I handed the microphone over to Bill McLaren. Nobody has mentioned rugby. And he was a wonderful ambassador because he didn't like Scotland to lose, but my goodness, he was the first to appreciate a Welsh or a French try. Could we try perhaps to look, even in the media, at people like Bill McLaren to represent us? And in terms of Oor Willie and the like, we've had people on television and radio, Stanley Baxter with Parliamo Glasgow, who stretch out to the world. At the end of the Olympics, they didn't have Auld Lang Syne, which the world sings. I've heard it in Helsinki at a student conference. I was proud to be Scots. When the tapestries are put together, could someone please make sure Tam O'Shant are wonderful, but can we also have some of the characters that have represented Scottish life?
Okay. All these hands coming up. Yes, right, the lady in the nice aqua colour. Yep.
I would like to nominate William Dick, who was the gentleman who started the first veterinary college and built it in Clyde Street in Edinburgh in 1826. And this evolved into veterinary schools all over the country and all over the world, and ended up with a marvellous new place out at the bush with the new centre for the animal welfare.
I mean, it strikes me as the names flow in, and there's probably countless ones to come, it's becoming almost as reminiscent, or almost reminiscent of that extraordinary titled book, The Scottish Enlightenment, or how Western Europe's poorest nation created our world and everything in it. Now, that's hyperbole. You know, listening to this flow comes back to, I mean, my trade is analytical history, and I try to answer questions. And this is, you know, there is a statistical thing here, and that is that this nation has contributed disproportionately in relation to its population base to a whole variety of development. Some of them not actually as positive as has been mentioned, but it's still quite extraordinary, and I don't think as scholars we have yet come up with a totally satisfactory answer to that particular basic question, which is at the very heart of the development of our nation over the last millennium.
What I have noticed with all the hands going up and the number of people that have asked is just how many women are putting forward suggestions. And I just wonder if I could perhaps ask the audience to have a think about what Scottish women have been instrumental in shaping Scotland. It is difficult because women have been written out of our history in the same way that women have been written out of most histories. I mean, that is why it's called his story, not her story. But I just wonder, you know, if we could maybe spend a few minutes thinking about women.
With a kind of footnote, presiding officer, and that is that certainly over the last 30 years, in academic history at least, that balance is starting to be righted. There's no doubt about that. So that imbalance is starting to be righted.
I think it is, but I still maintain that, most of women's history, simply doesn't exist. There are women who have done the most marvellous things that, we will never know about. But
there's no contradiction between our points,
none,
because nobody reads academic history.
That's true. Okay, women in history. Yes, now I can see some hands going up. The lady in the light-coloured jacket.
Okay. What I was going to say was that the frieze in the National Portrait Gallery, which is also a kind of procession of famous Scots, is remarkable for the very few women in it. And I think we could do a lot better 100 years on. I absolutely agree with what Tom Devine says about the, if you like, the collective contribution of women to Scottish history, which is very often not expressed in terms of famous people. It's often in families, and it's in movements like the rent strike or Elsie Ingalls' Scottish Women's Hospitals. But at the same time, if Scottish girls come and look at the tapestry, which has been made, I don't know by how many women, but I think probably quite a large percentage of the stitchers are women, and they only see, I think the number of individuals was something like a dozen out of about 70. It's not a great set of role models, and I think we can quite easily find a number of women who have contributed, who are in fact quite famous. They're not necessarily always household names, but they've contributed. I won't go. I've got plenty of names I could suggest. I'll just give you a couple. Mary Stopes, who was the birth control pioneer, was Scottish. Jean Redpath, the singer. The people who are a lot of the living people mentioned were women, so they come into that debate a little bit. But you can go back into Scottish history and find plenty of women's contributions, and I think it would be a very praiseworthy aim. Maybe it's hard to get 50% women onto a collective panel like that, and I don't know what the numbers are, but certainly to up the percentage of named women, because there are named Scottish women who could be inspiring the people who in years to come are going to look at this tapestry. It's not just for 2012, it's for 2050.
Can I just say that one name that I think should absolutely be there is Jean Redpath. I mean, who can ever forget the opening of the Scottish Parliament and that wonderful singing? And Sheena Wellington is a name, as well as Jean Redpath. I think, two fine singers.
Tricia, I think perhaps we can address that point. It's a very important point.
Yeah, it is. I really think that there's a danger of distortion. The historical record ignores women virtually for most of our history. Of course, they were there. Of course, they took a hugely important motive hand in what happened, but it is largely anonymous.
I think it's, sorry.
And I think we've tried to compensate for that with generic panels which look at the contribution that women made. I mentioned bondagers, I mentioned the Clown Nian and Scatan, the herring gutters and so on, weavers, the mills and so on. We've tried to address it, but not by finding women whose names barely register on the historical record before 1800, let's say.
Sorry.
Rosemary.
Well, I was just going to suggest that there are one or two names that I thought maybe would actually specific women who could be included historically, who also represent something bigger. For example, you've got Agnes Sampson, who was one of the North Berwick witches, who was killed, tortured to death. She may actually have been a witch, but that doesn't mean that her story is any less terrible, and she would stand for that entire persecution. And so that's one way that you do see women, absolute victims, in the kind of states that we had.
Yeah.
Somebody else, an amazing entrepreneur, Mary Erskine. She was a private banker, a 17th century banker who went on to promote education for women. Now again, I think she's really valuable, somebody worth discussing. And then just a couple who don't really fit a category except as incredibly brave. There's Jenny Geddes, who stood up, created a riot, or so they think anyway, in St Giles Cathedral just up the road, because she didn't like the prayer book they were introducing. And I can tell you, as someone who's worked with the Church of Scotland, it is very hard standing up against the church, so she gets, my vote. And then how about Flora MacDonald? I mean, just an amazing heroine as well as a brave woman. And she stands for women who are, again, out of sight, but have done astonishing things to let men do what they have to do.
She's probably better remembered than the transvestite that she was trying to help. But there is actually now professionally, it's possible to do this in a way which it wasn't even 30, 20 years ago, because there's that marvellous dictionary of Scottish women, historical dictionary with its encyclopedic entries covering well over 1,000 women, and I think it's 450, 500 pages long. But I think in terms of the motifs that Alice was going on about, rather than necessarily specific names of women, another area, I mean, the rent strike's already been talked about, but those fairly intermittent protests against clearance and eviction in the Gaelt Act, and then culminating in the Great Crofters' War or Rebellion of the late 1870s, early 1880s. It was often the women, the Battle of the Braes has been mentioned. It was often the women of the townships who were to the fore in terms of some of these, and they weren't frequent, it has to be admitted, but they did exist. Highlands were not peaceful during the Great Evictions, and often women were at the heart of the assaults in particular, and the undressing or de-trousering of the factors' men as they tried to implement the eviction process.
I think what's worth pointing out is that throughout the 145 panels of the tapestry, we have lit on episodes like the Battle of the Braes, which were conducted mostly by women. There are several like that. But of course, the individuals involved, yes, their names are known, but in history, their names are often not known. So that's a difficulty. There's no getting around that, I'm afraid.
A great boon for this kind of rebalancing of our history has been the rise from the 1960s, 1970s of social history. Because, of course, the old form of history was political history, which has its place, of course, but it was essentially the history of elites. And in a patriarchal society, that's the kind of society we've had for most of the nation's history. Women were going to be marginalised in that. But social history allowed, if you like, the people below not only to be seen, but to speak in terms of the records, albeit patchy, that they've left.
Okay, can we move on? The lady third in from the right up the back, Liz. Put on your microphone. That's it. No, up the back. Yep.
Yes, it's on, Trish. I'm interested to hear you talking about Sheena Wellington, Trish, and the song keeps going through my head. One of her famous ones, how the women of Dundee kept the bairns of Dundee fed during all the problems when men couldn't get work and there were strikes and everything going on. That is somebody I feel should be included. But also, Rosemary, I was a wee bit disappointed in your list of women as well, or maybe all of you, in that Wendy Wood has not been mentioned, to my great consternation. Wendy, who, when I was a student, I was fortunate enough to be a friend of Wendy Wood's and realise how much she had done since right through the 30s to keep the spirit of Scotland alive. She was a true Scottish patriot. And I don't mean in a particularly political sense at all. Wendy did stories, I think some of us may remember how she used to do on Children's Hour on television, her stories to the children of Scotland. She wrote books for children. She told stories. She kept so much alive that was Scottish through all our doldrum years. And I think she ought to be recognised and remembered. Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman, second back row with the nice pink shirt on.
Okay, that's me. A few women. Mary of Guise, great regent of Scotland, would fit into categories, all sorts of categories. A couple of countesses. Countess of Erskine, who built up the Alloa glassworks in the 18th century, an interesting industrialist. And Eva, Countess of Rosebery, without whom the Edinburgh Festival wouldn't exist, and who, on the winnings of the Derby, I think in whenever it was, funded the first Edinburgh Festival.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking for people. Yes, the lady in green. That's you?
Hi, two points. One is actually in support of the nomination of Mary Stopes. In some ways, she actually, as amongst the names of women that have come out, she, like James Small in the Swing Plough, has had an international influence, but also in terms of empowering women, she's absolutely crucial to sort of development of changes in gender relations within Scotland and much more widely. So I think she stands out as somebody who has a kind of profile that has been hugely important outside Scotland as well as within Scotland. And my other observation is in terms of the overall mix of people who end up as being the chosen, selected people, is to think about, we've talked a bit about gender balance, but I think it would be quite nice to see sort of balance geographically across the country. There's a lot of names that are coming up that are kind of central belt. So if there could be some regard to coverage geographically across the country, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think one of the problems about this country is, I remember the first ever US Army Air Force photograph of Europe by night, where the great blotches of light revealed the great urban conurbations. And there was the Ruhr arching into Belgium. There was the Black Country down into London. But the most extraordinary of all was the complete darkness north of the Highland Line and the complete darkness south of the Central Belt. We are living in a society which has been historically produced, and we are living in what you would almost call a demographic sandwich because of the huge migrations of people over the last 2.5 centuries into the Central Belt. So to some extent, I take the lady's point, there's got to be, and I think some of these people almost, I mean, certainly in the 19th century, represent small-town Scotland because their educational standards were especially rich and very developed. I take her point about the need for spread, but what I'm saying is that concentration in the central lowlands, the Fourth Clyde axis, is almost inevitable because that's where 80% of our people live and have lived really since the early 19th century.
I'd also add to that and say that, again, the balance of the whole tapestry in terms of the other 144 panels very much took a geographical sense of balance because we not only wanted to represent the Northern Isles, the Hebrides, the north of the Highland Line, we also wanted stitchers from those areas to make their own history in a literal sense. And I think we've achieved that in this studio. We've got a big map with pins on it, and there's lots of pins either side of the sandwich, as it were.
That is so critical in a society like Scotland. American graduate students coming to this country, a country which is smaller than the state of Virginia, regularly comment to me that they see it as a mosaic. Within short distances, differences obviously of accent, of landscape, even of weather, microclimates and all that sort of thing. And the fashioning that's going into localities in what is obviously a very, by their standards, a very ancient society. So I think it's brilliant what Alistair has just said, that the tapestry does seek to capture that, if you like, that rich mosaic, which in a very small territoriality is part of the essence of what Scotia is.
Indeed, and if you think about the first dozen names that Tom and I produced, you know, Calgacus in the northeast, and you know, Ninian in Galloway, and St Andrew, as it were, in Fife, and Columba in the Isles. That spread is there, I think.
Right, we don't have a great deal of time, so what I'm going to do is all the people who've got their hands up, I'm going to ask you to give me your name, not your own name, but the name that you would like to propose, and that way we can capture as many as possible. Gentleman up the back, Foreign, David.
Well, if I'm just going to do the names then, it's Roy Williamson, for obvious reasons.
Okay.
As the chorist, and a man that you probably don't know about called General John Forbes, who created Pittsburgh in the United States and therefore created the Anglo culture of the the English language in North America, which has become the lingua franca of the world. So it's down to the filming man, General John Forbes. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Gentleman sitting from the back row with a nice yellow tie on. Yep.
Governor Macquarie, the first Governor-General of Australia from the Isles. Joseph Lister, the first experimenter in surgical prevention of infection.
Okay. The lady right at the back. Yep.
James Simpson invented chloroform.
I'm sorry?
James Simpson invented chloroform.
Right, okay. The lady just in here, yep.
Like everybody, remove Lulu, possibly Queen Victoria, but I would add John Muir, National Parks System.
She's vital.
Okay, lady in front.
Thomas Carlyle, George Mackay Brown, and our national gargle, Johnny Walker.
Gentleman sitting in the middle of this row, yep. Microphone should be coming. That's it.
Yep. Okay. It's more on the sporting side. I think we've just seen the Olympics, and I think people like Alan Wells have honoured Scotland very well. Dick McTaggart, Olympic medalist 1956, one of the best boxers we've ever had. And Liz McColgan, to put on the women's side. She was a world champion, 10,000 metres. And on the football side, I would think that Jim Baxter was a Scottish icon when he toyed with the English defence in 1967.
Well, Jim Baxter was certainly a Cowdenbeath icon. So he has...
No better icon could there be.
Absolutely. He actually came from Hill of Beath, not Cowdenbeath, but hey, us Cowdenbeathers just had it with our own. The gentleman in the red jacket. Sorry? Yep.
No, Mike. Just the Parliament itself is at the moment celebrating one of the artists who I think appeals to a much broader spectrum of Scottish public. Some of the names there that were given are highly wonderful artists, but I think nothing would compare to George Wiley. The international reputation, great writer, the straw locomotive, the paper boat, and his writings like A Day Down a Gold Mine. And I think George should be on the list.
I agree George should be on the list. Yep.
I'd like to propose Jenny Lee, who was responsible for the Open University.
You mean that good Lochgelly girl? There's a theme coming in here. The gentleman, yes, about third back. Sorry? Microphone,
okay.
That's it.
Staying with that theme, could we have a Kelty Clippy? And more seriously, people like, well, James Watt wasn't mentioned, I don't think, at any point in time. I was quite surprised about that.
Okay.
Hugh Miller. And on the social theme, what about John McLean and Jimmy Reid?
Okay. You'll see I'm copying them all down here. Yes, lady.
Union analyst and honoured in George Square in Edinburgh.
Okay. Time for maybe a couple more. Yep. The lady in red. Pink.
Christelle Macmillan, a pacifist. I could take out quite a few of the saints and the royalty, actually. And Helena Kennedy.
Okay. Anybody who... The lady here? Who?
Rayburn.
I don't think so, no.
Yes, Henry Rayburn, yes.
Yeah, he was mentioned,
yeah.
right. Okay.
And what about Jim Clark, the racing driver?
He wasn't mentioned. The gentleman up the back.
About Walter Bauer, father of Scottish history. Donald Dewar hasn't been mentioned, I noticed, considering where we're sitting. He's there already. Okay, if you're going to have fictional and semi-fictional characters like Jenny Geddes, what about Ma Brune? And that's not necessarily
so,
as a funny one.
N. Brune?
Well.
And what about the
because
dandy?
Ma Brune was the mother of the nation.
Exactly.
That's why.
Exactly.
Well, Hen Brune was the bachelor uncle of the nation.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot of them around. Right, gentleman there.
What about Andrew Murray? General Roy of the Ordnance Survey? And I'd like to ask Tom Devine what he thinks about Witherspoon of Princeton.
Okay. Yeah, John Witherspoon was the fourth principal of the College of New Jersey.
Yep.
And given the odd lecturer in Princeton, and it's extraordinary to enter the great chapel of probably one of the 5 great universities of the USA, which means one of the 5 great universities of the world, and see the Scottish Saltire on the right-hand side, and the arms, unfortunately not the University of Edinburgh, but the arms of the University of Glasgow, Via Veritas Vita, which is the connection back to the Witherstonian period. But, you know, this is why this is such a difficult exercise, especially abroad, the lasting impact of some of these Scottish intellectuals and scientists. I mean, I just reviewed an article the other day called Scotland's Intellectual Diaspora and the effect that has had, not simply in the Empire, but globally.
Okay. Gentleman right up the back.
James Gibbs Stewart, the Scottish economist who saved Malaysia in 1997 from the IMF and George Soros. He also wrote a book in 1983 that was suppressed about the banking system, but Mrs. Thatcher got hold of a copy.
I think we get that. Can we move on?
A very important man who's not remembered in Scotland, James Gibbs Stewart.
Okay, thank you very much. Last couple. Billy.
A female name who should definitely be there, arguably one of the greatest heroines of the Wars of Independence, Countess Isabella of Buchan, who left her family, her wealth, her husband to King Robert the Bruce at Scone and was later imprisoned in a cage in Berwick for her troubles. A wonderful, wonderful heroine of Scotland.
Right. Gentleman with his hand up to the middle. Yep.
Joseph Black, who came up with the idea of latent heat and identified carbon dioxide. Crum Brown, who took his wife's knitting and established a way of expressing molecular structure. William Robertson, who, without disrespect to anybody, has to be the greatest Scottish historian and established the contemporary style of writing history. Blair, who established literature as a topic of academic discussion. And then the most important person, Reverend Thomas Bayes. Without Thomas Bayes, Google wouldn't work, medical diagnosis wouldn't work. It's the foundation of pretty much all the computer-based reasoning you ever do.
I hate to disagree with my boss, because we've just heard from the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh, but I'm not convinced entirely about his reference to, although a great man, and obviously now renamed, our own school in Edinburgh, renamed after him, the William Robertson Wing. I'm not absolutely convinced he's the greatest Scottish historian of all time. Because there are two reasons for me saying this. One is personal. The second is that actually, Tim, Robertson didn't write very much about Scottish history. I mean, in fact, his primer on American history was the key text in American colleges for the history of America in the first half of the 19th century. So undeniably, yet another great product of Scotland's greatest university, but slight qualification about whether he's the best ever Scottish historian.
Oh, the hands are still going up, right. The lady right up at the back, beside the guy with the check shirt.
Poet and dramatist Joanna Baillie, a friend of Mary Somerville, the scientist, also admired by Sir Walter Scott, Lord Byron, Wordsworth. Bestseller in her time, but largely forgotten now.
Thank you. Alan Taylor. Up the back.
I was going to suggest Jean Armour as a sort of archetypal Scottish woman who's had to put up with a lot. But you could say James Boswell's wife, or many people like Meg, or in Tam O'Shanter, somebody waiting at home for things.
Or most women through the centuries, exactly, Alan, you know. Right. Anybody who has not yet already put forward names? I can see hands going up that I'm sure I've asked before. Right, okay. I'm going to take another couple. Right, the lady in the front. Yep.
Andy Whiteman for his work on land.
Okay, thank you. The lady up the back.
David Lindsay, author of Satire of the Three Estates.
Thank you very much. Right, now you can see what a difficult task it is going to be. What I have tried to do is, I've copied down the suggestions from our panellists. I've tried to also copy down all of the suggestions that everybody has made, and I'll make sure that you get along with a copy of the broadcast so that all the names that have been suggested today will be certainly considered. But I'm now told that what we want to do is to select the 8 most influential Scottish figures of all the ones that you know. Of all time. Now this is a huge challenge for you. I mean, I don't know if you consider yourself worthy of this task, but it is going to be asked of you anyway. So the list will appear on the screen in groups of 5 names at a time. Please click the corresponding letter next to the name of your favourite. I'm just reading out what I've been given, right? So there's going to be lists appearing on the screen. The lists have still not appeared on the screen. Is somebody going to put them up?
I have to do this by. Oh,
Lindsay, is this going to work? Here we go.
Ah.
Wow, there we go.
Very good.
Now, is it 8 groups?
I don't. How many groups are there, Jan? 4 groups, so there's 20 in all.
20 in all. So
is that right?
But how? I think what we need to do before anybody votes, I think what we need to do is to run through all of the groups so that you can see all of the names.
Absolutely.
And then we'll go back to the beginning and you can select the number that you wish to. So could we have, this is the first list, so if you can have a good look at the people who are on that list. You're all quite happy? Yeah?
How many votes do we have?
You're going to get 1 vote, right? So please look at the list there. Right, can we have the second list up? Lindsay, can we have the second? Okay. See technology.
It's going to take a minute for the other one to come up.
Yeah.
Okay. Talk amongst yourself.
But I don't see how they can be asking.
No, absolutely. No, that's right. Here we are.
Right, here's the second list. Ignore the bit where it says please vote. Please don't. Not at the moment. Just have a look at the names so you know who are coming. I don't understand.
No, this is going to be.
I mean, I think people better have 8.
8 votes, but we've only got 4 lists.
I think maybe what if we went through each name and asked them to vote on each name, and then we'll know how much each candidate gets. We'll then get the 8 votes. That's the way we can do it. So if you went through the first list and said, if you like this person, vote. Remember, you've only got 8 votes.
Right. They're on trust.
But they're on trust.
Right, we worked it out. Right, what we're going to do here. I have consulted with the experts on this. What we're going to do, Lindsay, is that we're going to go back to the first screen. Can you do that? Right. Now, when we go back to the first screen, we're going to ask you to remember that you've all got 8 votes. Now, you're on trust. I don't want anybody casting 9 votes instead of 8. Oh, wait a minute, Sandy's had another thought.
I've had a thought. I think it'll be difficult for people to decide when to cast their votes because they haven't seen all the names. And therefore, the only way we can do it, I think, is, given that we've got 4 lists, is to have 2 votes per page. Now, that means that you're going to have to make a slightly different selection from what you made if you had the whole. It's the only way you can do it. So everybody should vote during each list for 2 names, and then we'll see who gets the most votes.
I need to see if that's going to be technically competent to vote for 2 on each list. Lindsay. Could you come near the microphone and repeat that slowly?
Thank you. You need to take 1 vote per screen and it'll bring up the top results, the top 2 results for each screen at the end.
Yes, that
one vote per screen.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. We've just got a slight technical problem. We won't be a moment.
Right, talk among yourselves.
No, I'm going to put a pitch in for James Small.
Right, there's another picture for James. Right.
Hold on, we need our first list. We've gone on to the...
Yeah.
We'll go back to list 1. That's not list 1.
We're waiting to go back to list 1.
I think there's a wee
That's it. We want...
While I understand there's a technical hitch in this most wonderful parliament with electronic voting and all the rest of it. Hey ho, we've got a technical hitch. I crave your patience. It will be worth it. Once we get through this, there is going to be a small reception immediately afterwards, and you will be invited for wine and sandwiches, and that's worth the hanging on for, is it not? Right. Or to have the man or woman who could fix our voting system today, and I could give my guarantee that if we had such a man or woman, they'd definitely be on the list. But they're not. They're not. So I am advised that what we're going to have to do is forget about the electronic gizmos. We're going to go back to the good old-fashioned show of hands. Okay? So put down your gizmos, relax, right? I'm going to go through each list and I want you to vote twice. Now, again, you're on trust. You're only allowed to vote twice on each list, not 3 times and not 4. See, I could see that you always get one. You always get one.
No wonder the Scottish
so
Parliament is so well disciplined.
So what
Listen to the presiding officer.
so what we're going to do is a show of hands, and we're going to get our event staff who are going to count. Okay? Right. Okay. A question?
Repeat the question.
Which question was that? I've not asked it yet. I've just been giving you the instructions. Now here's the question. Right? I'm going to read out 5 names. Right? And I want you to vote on 5 of them. 2 out of 5. But please don't put up your hands till I read the first list in its entirety, because I want you to know all of the names that are on it. William Wallace, St Columba, John Knox, David Hume, and James Small. Now, out of those 5, I want you to vote for 2. Firstly, William Wallace.
Who are you going to vote for is the question.
Who are you going to vote for is the question.
For the eight most influential. Explain.
Sorry, you're being asked to vote for the 8 people that you consider of these lists to be the most influential in Scotland. Okay? Sorry. Right. So, the 5, and we've started, and it's William Wallace. So if you can keep your hand up until I ask you to put it down. It will be worth it. The wine's waiting for you all. That you captured them all? Right, thank you. St Columba. Right, okay. In the seat of democracy, which the Scottish Parliament is, and which I uphold at all times, there has been a suggestion made that when we go through the list of 5, that I look at the hands that are up instead of counting each one. I look at the hands and I make the decision about who is the most influential. Can I point out? This was not my suggestion. This was a suggestion of the panel. You know, I am not going. So I think that's probably the best way. I think we can probably get through this a lot quicker than the counting of the hands. I've heard that before, but the 3rd one on the list is John Knox. Right. 4th one on the list is David Hume. And the 5th one on the list is James Small.
I knew that would happen. I knew that would happen. My mission has failed.
Mission impossible.
Mission impossible.
What do you think? Human Wallace? Yes.
Okay. We are all agreed. I am relieved it wasn't just my decision. The 2 on this list are William Wallace and David Hume. Okay.
Yes, they wouldn't have got on.
We now go to the next list, and the next list is Mary Slessor, Robert Burns. Keep the hands down now. Mary Slessor, Robert Burns, Robert the Bruce, Chris Hoy, James Clerk Maxwell. So, firstly, Mary Slessor. Hands up. Okay. Robert Burns. I think that's pretty unanimous, actually. Robert the Bruce. Chris Hoy. James Clerk Maxwell. Burns and...
Difficult between Burns and Maxwell. Well, I thought
Burns is way ahead.
I think about both Burns and Clerk Maxwell. It's nearly a tie.
Why don't we just have a vote on those two?
Right, definitely Robert Burns, right? It seems to be...
Try a run-off again
between
Bruce and Maxwell.
Right, okay, I'm going to make you make a choice here between Robert the Bruce and James Clerk Maxwell. You're only allowed to put your hand up once this time. So those who think that Robert the Bruce is more influential than James Clerk Maxwell, put up your hands. Okay. Right, put the hands down. Those who think James Clerk Maxwell is the more influential, I think James Clerk Maxwell's got it. Yeah. Would you agree, guys?
That would never have happened even 5 years ago. It's amazing.
It's because I insisted on one of the committee rooms here being named after
It's
him.
imposed democracy, that's what it is, yes.
Right, okay. Next list, we have Shirley MacLaine, Walter Scott, Elsie Ingalls, David Livingstone, and Jean Redpath. Those who think Shirley MacLaine is the most influential Scot? Okay. Walter Scott? Okay, we like her literature, don't we? Elsie Ingalls? David Livingstone? Jean Redpath? Okay, would you agree, Walter Scott and Elsie Ingalls?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Our last group is going to be Bill McLaren, Eric Liddell, Ur Willie, Liz Lockhead, and Rayburn. Henry Rayburn, painter. Bill McLaren, hands?
The borders are standing up.
Okay. Eric Liddell. Ur Willie.
Quite a lot of support for Ur Willie.
Ma Brown. I was joking. Liz Lockhead. Henry Rayburn. Okay. Right. Agree, Liddell and Rayburn?
Liddell and Rayburn.
Right, okay.
Absolutely.
So what we have here is your suggestions of those who are the most influential. And the list is, and I'm sure you've all been watching me, William Wallace, David Hume, Robert Burns, James Clerk Maxwell, Walter Scott, Elsie Ingalls, Eric Liddell, and Henry Rayburn. Okay?
I think the audience should be congratulated, the presiding officer, on their acuity.
Indeed.
It's a remarkable list.
It is amazing.
Yes, I mean, if I could just go round you all very, very briefly and ask, what do you think of the 8 most influential? Sandy?
No, I think that's a very interesting and rather well balanced list. I have personal delight in seeing Hume there, and I think James Clerk Maxwell in terms of world intellectual history. But then I think it's nice also to see a great sportsman and a great artist. It's very nice. There's yes, I'd be very comfortable with that. I'm not saying necessarily that we're not saying we're entirely bound by this. Are we? Or are we? No. That's another.
Told you it wasn't a democracy.
You can ask them to put their hands up if they want the two to be entirely bound.
Yes.
No. Dangerous stuff, this.
I think we will certainly, we will have to take this very seriously and want to take it very seriously. But I'm deferring to those in the committee who are deciding these matters. Do you want to be bound by that?
Alistair.
No, I'm absolutely gutted. Where is James Small? Never mind. I've got Walter Scott, which is great. Yeah. But actually, one of the things that is marvellous about the list is it's spread. We've got a warrior, a philosopher, a poet, a scientist, a novelist, the great Elsie Inglis. My kids were born at Elsie Inglis Hospital. We've got an athlete and we've got a painter. Yeah. That's fantastically diverse. So congratulations, well done.
What I would say, if I could just add a little comment to this issue of the final shape of the list, I think this is a very, very important part of the overall consultation that we're carrying out, and this will be very powerful. But we're also approaching the broader public through the newspapers, and so we're wanting to make this as broad a consultation as possible. So it would be interesting if we put this list to the general public through the papers to see how they would shade it, add to it, or indeed accept it. So I think this has been marvellous.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, just a number of very quick kind of bullet points. First is that to support what's already been said, tremendous variety and balance. The other thing is wonderful to see the life of the mind so far up there. People have paid attention to the word influence, which is very important. So no celebrities at all, which is absolutely brilliant given our obsessed culture of the year 2012. Liddell represents something more than sport, and that's good that he's in there as well. And as I said to you before, Tricia, just a few seconds ago, you wouldn't have had Clark Maxwell in that list even 5 years ago. So I think it's possibly a reflection of a greater awareness of the contribution that particular Scots have made over time. It's wonderful to see the absence of the two pop-up figures of the history of Scotland, namely Mary Queen of Scots and Charles Edward Stuart.
Rosemary.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is it's not a sort of cartoon version of Scotland, which is so wonderful to see. And also interesting, it's one woman out of 8, and I think in a way that just represents exactly what we've been talking about, how few women have been influential. It's fantastic to see her there. I think it's a splendid list.
Okay. We talk a lot about legacy. We've talked about legacy of the Olympic Games and all the rest of it. But I wonder, Alistair, if you could maybe talk for a couple of minutes about the tapestry and what you see in terms of the legacy of the tapestry.
One of the things that Sandy said right at the beginning was what was so impressive was the reaction of individuals who were looking at this. And in one of the rooms downstairs in the Parliament, we had a meeting of the Stitchers, a Stitch in Time, and some of the panels are partly completed, and I hadn't seen that. And there's a stunning panel which illustrates the first house ever found in Scotland at Barnes Ness in East Lothian, constructed sometime around 8000 BC. And there's a beautiful drawing by Andrew Crummy that has been converted into a hunter-gatherer wearing skins, as it were, looking a bit like the Forest Indians of the eastern United States. A quite extraordinary piece of art. You wanted to touch it. I think that this tapestry will have an extraordinary impact on all who see it. And what's wonderful about this is that it's Scotland's history made by 500 Scottish people all over Scotland. And I think it'll have a tremendous legacy. Usually it's been events that have been memorialised by tapestries, famously Battle of Hastings and indeed, as Sandy said, Battle of Preston Pans. This is the story of a nation made into a tapestry, and I think it will be moving, impressive and unique.
And wonderful also that for a change, the word stitch up has a positive vibration, given recent events.
We have spoken throughout today about the artist responsible for the tapestry, Andrew Crunley, and Andrew's actually here. Andrew, would you just like to say hello and come and join us? Come and join us, Andrew. This is the man who is responsible for all the beautiful panels and is the man that's responsible for going to make it look absolutely beautiful. Can I thank all of our panellists today, to Rosemary, to Tom, to Alistair, to Sandy, for what I think has been an absolutely stimulating afternoon. Can I thank each and every one of you for taking part in this. Can I thank you for all the names and suggestions that you've made, for the interaction, the fact that we've never managed to fight with each other, even though we disagree. I think it's been a great afternoon. I'm looking forward to seeing the names that we've selected and some of the other names that have been punted about today to be part of the final tapestry. I know I'm going to be there. As one of the 4 presiding officers, they told me, and I admit I cried. Because when we talk about legacy, this whole tapestry is for our children and for our grandchildren and for our great-great-grandchildren. And that makes me really humble and really proud that we are seeing the beginning of something spectacular that people will look at for hundreds of years. And you can all say that you took part in the initial discussions about the names. And can I thank you so much? And now, let's go and have some wine and some sandwiches. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.